God, through his letter to Paul, from Paul, was teaching the Philippians to have a mind for eternity. We've been working on Philippians long enough now, and we've been separated long enough now, and possibly with the streaming, you may or may not have always been able to see the services. So I want to rehearse with you for just a moment, big picture of Philippians, and I want to do that in just a few minutes as we then get to our text for today. You see, Paul was teaching Philippians, have a mind for eternity. Have a mind for what is to come. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, Paul was challenging the Colossians people with this same things. He says, if you are a Christian, if you then be risen with Christ, if you are a Christian, seek heavenly things. Now, that's not one of these things. That's one of these things. You're a Christian. You've got something that is so important. Don't lose your focus. Don't lose your sight. Set your gaze on things above. Have a mind for eternity. You see, Philippians is going to quickly work us through some things that Paul was hoping would be an encouragement that would bring joy to people. In chapter 1, he says, you are going to have a personal journey with the gospel. And it's interesting, Paul always does this combination. He's going to talk about you, then he's going to talk about me, talking about Paul, and then he's going to talk about others, and then he's going to talk about us. Because you see, it's personal, and yet it's more than just you. It's you, it's me, it's others, and it's us. And so he encourages them. He says, God is working in you in chapter 1. He says, and God is working through you. And then he says, verse 10 of chapter 1, he says, and God is working in me. And then God is working in and through others. About verse 14. And then he says, God is working in and through us. The end of chapter 1. Now we come to chapter 2, and he talks about a personal role with the gospel. He talked about that personal journey in chapter 1. In chapter 2, he's going to talk about the personal role that each of us play. It is so easy to get disconnected and to feel like, what do I really have in this whole thing? And Paul in chapter 2 is saying, he begins by talking about Christ. And then he talks about you. And then Paul talks about himself. And then Paul talks about others. You see what he's doing? He's reminding us we are a community of believers. This is a global thing that's going on. And he's talking about not only where he is, but he's talking about the people in Philippi, and he's talking about the people that are in different locations. And he says, you need to remember your personal role with the gospel. You see, each of us has a role in the spread of the gospel. Jesus Christ said, I will fulfill my role. But then he looks at us and he says, you work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Not trying to figure out if you're saved. We're saved by grace through faith. It is Jesus Christ alone that saves us. If you're still trying to figure out, am I saved or not saved? What you need to figure out is, have you placed your faith in Jesus Christ? If you have, then Jesus Christ totally paid your sin debt, right? It's totally about Jesus Christ. You see, the problem is not, am I doing good enough to be saved? The answer to that is you are not. You'll never be good enough to be saved. You'll never do enough good works. You'll never be able to prove that you were worthy of being saved. It's all about Jesus Christ. So, what is your role? Your role is to bring glory to God and to get the gospel out. And sometimes your role in getting the gospel out changes. I have been a lawn maintenance keeper. I have been a representative that traveled to different schools. I have been a pastor. I have been a bus driver. I am now a pastor again. You see, my role in what God has changes, but I still have a part. Each of you still has a part. You see, Paul is going to say, he mentions Jesus Christ's role, then he talks about your role, then you notice he says, now, if God's role for me is to be spent, to be poured out for your sake, to build other believers, he said, okay, that's my role right now. And then he talks about Timothy and Epaphroditus. And he says, here was their role. And then he ends with the us again. You see, you're not alone. You're not out there by yourself. Your role may be changing right now. And the way you're having to function may be different. But he says, please don't forget that. Then, in chapter 3, he talks about a personal focus with the gospel. He's going to talk about your relationship. And again, he talks about you. And then he talks about me, Paul. And then he talks about us. And you know what he says? Enjoy Jesus. Enjoy Jesus. He said, you know, I had this huge pedigree. I did this, and I did this, and I was this, and I was this. And if anybody could say, look at me, I ought to be really proud of who I am. He says, you know what? I realized I count all that stuff as worthless. I just want to know Jesus. Don't get caught up in the comparison and competitive game in Christianity. You are now a citizen of God's kingdom. And then finally we come to chapter 4, and he reminds them of something which should bring them joy again. And that is a personal investment in what's going on. Others, he's going to talk about, and then he's going to talk about you, and then Paul's going to talk about himself. And each time, you notice the theme, every chapter, you, me, others, us. You, me, others, us. Christ, you, me, others, us. And in every one of these, he is reminding them. You see, a week and a half ago, we looked at verses 10 through 13 on a Wednesday night. And you know the secret of contentment is trusting Jesus with the details. I can get so worked up when I start trying to handle everything. And he says, oh, remember, the secret of contentment is trusting Jesus with the details. That would have been like on the 6th. If you want to go back and just maybe rehearse that in your mind, you can go to the YouTube channel if you want to watch it, or you can go to the podcasting and just listen to it if it's something while you're traveling you'd like to do. But the secret to contentment, now, let's go a little bit further and now look at the rest of the chapter. Paul said he had learned to trust the Lord and to stay focused on his eternal investment. That wasn't something that came naturally. It was something that he had to learn this concept. In chapter 1, it was the investment of staying for the benefit of others for the sake of the gospel. So Paul said, When I said my heart is to be in heaven, but I know my role right now is to be here on earth, and so what did Paul say? So I'm staying here. Why? It's an eternal investment. Why did I move to Fargo? Why do you stay in Fargo? Why are they living in other locations? The goal ought to be an eternal investment. We want the eternal investment. Now, last week we looked at parenting for the sake of the gospel. You say, you didn't say that last week. No, I didn't. But that's exactly what I taught. Out of Proverbs chapter 31. And Wednesday night, I was talking about how do you influence a nation? You know what we're talking about? Parenting for the sake of the gospel. Why do I do what I do as a dad? What's your goal? And remember, I challenged you to write out what your goal is for your family. What do you want to do? You may not be able to control everything in your family, but I would challenge you with this. What is your goal? What's your role? What do you want to accomplish by being in that family? What do I want my family to see? What do I want my boys and my girl at this point, though they are all adults, what do I want them to every time they talk with me to see? So, Paul's going to address contentment and investment. Jesus taught that where your treasure is, your heart's going to be there also. What you really think is important will determine what you do with your resources. Now, talking about money, but talking about time, talking about your attention, all of these things are the resources that you have. And Paul is saying, contentment and investment come when you really focus on eternity. So let's begin with verse 14, investment in the unchanging promise of God. Verse 14, Paul says, notwithstanding you have well done, that you did communicate with my affliction. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica ye sent once and again unto my necessity. Not that I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. You notice Paul's focus? Paul wasn't saying, I want more. I can't believe people haven't supported me more. I can't believe that that you guys waited so long to give. Paul said, I'm so thankful that by your giving, you have invested in the gospel, and you will have money, you will have fruit in your account. You see the focus? The focus is not horizontal, the focus is vertical. The focus is, what do we know about eternity? What do you really believe? You see, giving is always a sore spot for the unsaved, and even for some saved people. The term fleecing the sheep. If there's probably anything I am more sensitive about, is that whole concept of making people feel like I'm somehow twisting your arm. I'm somehow trying to do something that I can get from you. It's been probably 4 months ago now, I said, I think this is a really good investment in this missionary. If you want to give toward that, I would encourage you to do that, because I think it's going to have a really good return in eternity. You know, when you talk with any kind of financial advisor, they're always saying, well, you know, we can't promise that the results are going to be like it's been in the past, but we think this is a really good investment. The one thing I can tell you today is, I can tell you this is a really good investment that cannot be hurt. Remember Jesus teaching in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus said, I'm going to talk about a treasure that cannot rust or chip or deteriorate. It can't lose its value. Well, over the last 3 months, if you've had any money, you've taken a beating on it, haven't you? Your investments have gone down. I mean, my really good investments that were really conservative, so they really weren't making much, so is that a good investment, not a good investment? I don't know. But my really good investments were the ones that only took a 10 or a 20% loss. My more progressive investments, it may be a little while till I retire. Maybe a long while. All of us have gone through that. If you have anything, you say, well, I invested in gold. Well, you know what? I hope it stays really high in value for you forever. But what's Paul saying? Paul's saying, and as we learned about contentment, Paul was saying, you know, I've learned in whatever condition I am in, I can be content. Why? Because I trust God with what's taking place. Paul said, you know, if people chose to invest in my ministry, I'm an apostle, don't I have the right to do these things? Don't I have the right to charge? But you know what Paul's focus was? It's all about the gospel. I'm going to use my resources to be able to get the gospel out. And he says, for your sake, I'm so glad that you all sent, because you've got fruit in your account. And you know what? That's something that no matter how much they shut down our government, it won't change. That investment is for eternity. I'm so excited about that. You know, the things that we do count for eternity. I think about the small investment in Doug Smith's life. 7 months. I only knew the man for about 8 months total. Doug's in heaven today. Was that worth once a week for an hour, hour and a half for 7 months? I can't think of a better investment. Not only that, I gained a great friend. We had a wonderful time. Now, maybe I could have gotten a second job. Maybe I could have been working, and And then, of course, everything that I put in the bank would have been cut in half anyway. You see, Paul is saying, invest in the unchanging promise of God. You see, the unsaved are always thinking that we're trying to get their money. And Paul's saying, no, you don't understand. I'm just trying to tell you this is a really good investment. You don't have to give toward this. What did Paul say? I'm positive my God will supply all my need. God will take care of me. You know, I've been in ministry long enough now to know there are times when I've had some people come and say, well, you know what? I'm not going to do anything to help you. And my response is, God's going to supply either through you or in spite of you, but God's going to supply. That's such an encouraging thought. Why? Because contentment comes when you can trust God with the details. I don't know the details. I don't know how God's going to provide. I just know God. And that's the same way for you. Paul uses this illustration in verse 10. We go through seasons, and he talks about flourishing. Your care for me hath flourished again. The idea here is of a budding tree. You go through winter seasons, and there's not really a whole lot going on with the tree, is there? And then spring comes, and all of a sudden you begin to see all of this growth come. You see, the tree didn't get moved. The circumstances changed. I don't know what God's going to do. I do know God is planting this church in Fargo right now on purpose because he has a plan for us, and he's brought all of us together. And we're going to go through some winter seasons, and we're going to go through some spring seasons. And our goal is to just be faithful where God's put us. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be in Fargo forever. It just means he's got you here right now. So don't worry about the details. Focus on the investment in eternity. In verses 14 through 17, he talks about this idea of giving and receiving. He's talking about a physical and a spiritual investment. They gave to Paul physically, and they received spiritually from the Lord. In verse 18, he talks about a sacrifice, something laid on the altar for God. He says, which were sent from you, an odor of a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable and well-pleasing to God. Now, think for just a moment. What are some other sacrifices that God says that we give? It's not just all about money. Because really, where our heart is where we put our treasure, and where our treasure is where our focus, where our heart is going to be. Well, in Romans chapter 12, he says, give yourself. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies. He's saying, give yourself to God. In Hebrews chapter 13, he talks about the sacrifice of the praise from our lips. Singing is really important. Testimony is really important. Giving of ourselves is really important. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 6, he talks about the sacrifice of good works. Now, that's not earning a salvation. That's not, all that is saying it's an investment. I can invest with my resources, with my body. I can invest with the praise, the things that I speak. I can give resources. I can give through my time. And then in verses 18 and 19, he talks about understanding what has taken place. He says, you gave out of your poverty. And God promises he will still take care of all your needs. Investment comes from the resources that God has provided. Our resources are the providence of God, the power of God, the promises of God. Those are the things that we all have. But investment comes when you trust God with the details. Again, I'm not trying to coerce you. I'm just trying to encourage you. Don't lose sight. You can trust God. He will take care of you. We manage what we have. We don't manage what we don't have. You can't manage what you don't have in your possession. That's the reason why in giving, I don't encourage you to give what you don't have. I just encourage you to manage what you do have. So when we come to missions, I'm going to encourage you, look at your resources that you have and what would you like to invest specifically in gospel ministry, for foreign gospel ministry, for that which is away from here. And I'm going to encourage you, you decide, but you can't manage what you don't have. You can only manage what you do have. And you have to look at that and you have to say, I have to be a good steward. I have to decide, what do I need to take care of my family? Because you see, my family is an eternal investment, right? And I've got to make sure that I am looking at my community, because my community is an eternal investment. And that includes then, what will I invest with this church? And what will that be with those that are away from this church, people that have gone places where I can't go? And so we're looking at all this investment, but it comes from what we do have, not from what we don't have. Part of the growth in a believer is the more we learn to trust God, the more we're willing to give God first. Now, that doesn't mean you don't plan. That doesn't mean you haven't thought things through. You can only give from what you have. But I would encourage you, give first, not last. I never have anything left over. If you budgeted, it's gonna go somewhere. So what you do is you budget God in, because He's the one who's provided. And again, this is not one of these. This is a great opportunity. You have the opportunity to invest in eternity. So what was Paul's secret for joy? How did Paul handle this? How did Paul say, oh, I wish you could understand, this has been great. I don't like my circumstances at all. I wouldn't want to be in my circumstances. I don't want you to be in my circumstances, but let me tell you what God's done with my circumstances. It's like, is this guy schizophrenic? Is he struggling in his mind? And the answer is no, he wasn't. He was content to trust Jesus Christ with the details. But whatever circumstance he was in, he used it for the spread of the gospel and to encourage other believers. So today, what circumstances are you in? We're all different. Some of you are at home. You're stuck. Some of you are out and about now a little bit. Some of you, it's just beginning to open back up, and it may be a long time. Paul's secret for joy was learning every day, at the beginning of the day, to focus on the eternal investment. How's today going to count? Well, I'm going to be here in the house all day today. Okay, how's it going to count? You say, well, there's no one else in my house. Okay. How are you going to make it count? It's your call. You can not do anything. But he says, work out your own salvation. Work out your role. Work out your purpose. First of all, just make God a top priority. Second of all, let the Holy Spirit renew your mind through the Word. It makes a huge difference in my mind every day if the first thing in the morning, if I just start with some Scripture. Now, some days I've got a lot of time. Other days I might not have as much time. And for you, it might be that same way. But I would encourage you to do this. Spend time while your mind still hasn't been inundated with everything else. My family will tell you the sharpest time for me every morning is before anything else has gone on. After that, okay, whatever. But my mind's going to be distracted. But the very first thing in the morning, I get up early enough that I'm not feeling the pressure of I got to get this done right away. So ask God to give you a view of your personal journey. Paul could back up and say, because I've been in jail, all of Caesar's household now knows. And then he sends a greeting from all these soldiers. That just to me is amazing. Remember, who was the man that was in charge in Rome at this point? Nero. A crazy man. a man that was blindly ambitious, a man that would kill everyone around him to stay in control. And Paul says, greetings from all his soldiers. And I got to know all these soldiers because I was in prison, so don't feel bad for me. Paul wasn't saying, oh, I hope I get to stay in prison. But since that's where he was, ask God to give you a personal view of your journey that you're on for the gospel. This will get you through hard times. When I look back and I think of opportunities for witnessing when I was at a low time in my life, when I look back and I think about people that received Christ during that low time in my life, I don't look at those as bad times. In fact, pretty amazing times. You know, when my salary was cut more than half, I didn't know how I was going to stay in my home, pay my utilities. You know, people were getting saved. Nothing really changed in my life. My bills were paid. I had a great time with my wife. Had a fun time with my family. I can look back at that and say, that was a pretty good investment. How about your personal view of your role to play in the gospel? Every morning, just stop and think, so what's going to be my role today? Think about your personal relationship with Jesus Christ every day. It'll help you keep Jesus first place, but it'll also keep you from getting panicked because Jesus is still in charge. And then what's going to be your personal view of your investment in the gospel? And this will help you with your daily details every day. Investing in eternity. These past few months have been really volatile in our financial markets. It's been brutal on our personal investments. Paul says, stay eternally focused. Stay eternally focused. Keep things in perspective. Do what you do remembering the gospel today. Living in view of the gospel, or life in view of the gospel, will bring you joy. So let me ask you this. How will Paul's little letter challenge you today? How will you live? Only between yourself there, as you're just thinking, how's your focus been over the last few weeks? Are you discouraged because of your circumstances, or maybe a relationship or a problem? Do you feel discouraged because you don't measure up to what others are expecting? Do you feel discouraged because you don't have what you want? A mind on eternity will help put life back into perspective. Let's bow our heads for prayer.